In this episode, I speak with Sam Lewis of ExpensePlus, all about budgeting, the pitfalls, the methods to set budgeting, and the spiritual principles around it too. Now, before we get into the episode, I need to tell you about CPD, Continuous Professional Development. If you are an AOG GB minister, then CPD is for you. It is a platform where you can log and track your personal professional development activities, like the books that you're reading, the podcasts that you're listening to, like this one. You can log it on there and you can earn points and prizes as you go as well. Just go to portal.aoggb.com to sign up today. Right, on with the podcast. That's CPD Show. Welcome back to That CPD Show. My name is Chris and I'll be your host for today. And today's podcast is all about budgeting. So my guest is Sam Lewis, who is the co-founder of ExpensePlus, which is a brilliant fund accounting package designed for churches. So before ExpensePlus, Sam worked for 7 years as the operations manager of a large multi-site church in Leeds. During that time, he helped the church save significant amounts of time and money through the implementation of better systems and processes. Sam is passionate about supporting churches to simplify and streamline their financial processes and equipping churches to manage their finances well. Alongside David Pearson, the legend, Sam helps to write many of the finance guide pages on the AOG Intranet. Well done, Sam, and well done, David, as well. Sam is married with 3 children and lives in Leeds. He loves board games, DIY, spending time with family and getting out into the Yorkshire Dales, being part of his kids ministry as well at church. So brilliant. Sam, welcome to the podcast. It is great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Brilliant. And I noted from your bio that you're a board game fan, as am I. What is your favourite board game?
It's a tough question. We have got a lot of board games in our house. In fact, our cupboard is jam-packed. I love strategy board games, and probably right now I'd say my favourite board game is Seven Wonders, which is a really great game if you've not played it. It's fairly quick to play. It's really great, and it just works really well for a group of people as well.
Brilliant. Yes, I'm a Settlers of Catan kind of person, but I don't normally have the 3 days to play it. So but it is an excellent game. Haven't played it in a few years, but it is my favourite. But of course, my other favourite, I guess this counts as a board game, chess. I love chess. So I do enjoy playing chess. I'll often be playing against the computer on my phone. It's always a good way to pass the time. Keeps the mind active. So yes, brilliant. Well, we are going to move on from board games because we could spend a lot of time talking about board games, but actually we need to talk about budgeting today, which is really, really important. But before we start talking about budgeting, Sam, it'd be great to talk about ExpensePlus and hear a little bit about what ExpensePlus is and why you started it and all those kind of things. So Sam, tell me about ExpensePlus.
Really happy to do that. So ExpensePlus started quite simply because we were trying to simplify and improve our own church's financial processes. We used to spend a lot of time kind of with inefficient paper-based financial processes, so filling out paper expense forms, getting approval signatures, printing and then filing receipts, etc. And the main problem with this was that without having a kind of digital kind of streamlined process flow for managing kind of expenses and invoices and other payments, we then had to pay our bookkeepers to key all of the information off of the paper-based forms that we're using into our finance package to create monthly accounts. The software we were using was probably best described as clunky, and our financial processes outside of this were pretty much all built around the limitations of the software we were using, with everything having to go through the bookkeeper, which was really inefficient, particularly as our bookkeeper kind of only worked part-time. We got financial reports out of the software. They were emailed out, but they weren't drillable. Budget holders had no way to kind of easily access up-to-date information from themselves, and so consequently didn't take very much ownership of the budgets they were being asked to manage. And so our reports, like many churches actually, were just largely historical records rather than providing up-to-date financial information that our team could use to proactively make better decisions. So we looked at some other charity accounting packages that were out there. These kind of were no better. They didn't do what we were after. We considered using business accounting packages like Xero, but as you'll know, that business accounting and fund accounting or charity accounting are not the same thing. They don't work in the same way, and so packages like Xero don't have fund management, they don't have gift aid management, they don't have donation reports, they don't have SORP compliant year-end kind of accounts or reports, and so so having checked that out, we were really fortunate that kind of God gave us everything we needed to build our own fund accounting package: the team, the skills, the experience, the ideas, the connections, and the resources. And so that's why that's kind of when we set about building ExpensePlus, which is a brilliant cloud-based fund accounting package that provides churches with efficient, streamlined process flows. It's easy to navigate, and it has everything churches need to manage their finances well. And I'd say the response from churches to ExpensePlus has absolutely been incredible. We started with something that we created to bless and serve our own church, and it's now used by thousands of churches, and it's got brilliant kind of reviews on Google. And for me, it's just such a privilege to get to journey with churches that use ExpensePlus and hear the difference that it's making for their churches. And it's such a joy to help build God's kingdom, not just in the software with the software we've created, but also in training and supporting churches as well, which we're able to do.
Yeah, that's great. And I know many churches that use ExpensePlus, and it's a real benefit and help to them. So if you are a church and you do not have a portal and a platform for your expenses, definitely check out ExpensePlus. So brilliant. Well, that's about ExpensePlus. We're going to dive into talk about budgeting today. And probably before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, we do kind of need to sort of zoom out and look at the kind of 30,000 foot of it. So let's talk about the why of creating a budget. What are the benefits of having a budget, Sam?
Yeah, I think this is a great place to start, isn't it? But and I'm sure that there are lots of really great definitions out there for what a budget is. But my one, which I'm going to use today, is simply that a budget is a simple yet powerful tool that can help your church make good financial decisions. And I guess that leads into the next question was, well, how does it do that? Well, an effective budget can really help you with planning how you're going to spend money and establishing your priorities as a church so that you spend money on the right things. It can support effective decision making. Obviously, if you've got a plan, then you can use that to make effective decisions. And it can provide a benchmark for measuring finances against. So typically when you're looking at income and expenditure reports, you would be comparing them to the budget that you've set. A budget can also help mitigate risk of and prevent overspending. And it also helps build trust with donors that their money is being managed well. A budget is a really essential tool, I'd suggest, to enabling churches to kind of manage money in an accountable way. It's also good practice to have a budget. But for me, most importantly, your budget can enable your church to better achieve its vision and goals. Like a budget is one of the, or your finances of your church are one of the key resources that kind of God gives us to use to kind of outwork the vision and the mission of the church. And so it's really important from that perspective as well. And I know we're going to be discussing questions, but I thought I'd throw out a question for those watching this podcast, which is, does your church have a budget? And if so, how effective is that budget in shaping how your church uses its financial resources and helping you manage money well? Not just having a spreadsheet, which you call a budget, but actually shaping the decisions and how you kind of manage your finances as a church.
Yeah, great question to ask, and I think it'd be really good to hear some of the answers as well to that question. Well, if that's the why of the budget, we probably need to go into a bit of the how. So what are some of the factors we need to consider when we're creating a budget? What are some of those things?
I mean, it's a super question. And having worked with many, many churches over many, many years, I'd suggest that there are loads of different ways that churches create budgets and different approaches to that. From the no budget approach, which I personally wouldn't suggest, but churches that sort of just don't do budgeting, to many churches which do a budget, but then don't actually use the budget that they've created. And unfortunately, that sort of lands at the same place as not having created a budget. In terms of actually putting a budget together, there's the kind of like like no change, just copy what you did last year. That's increasingly hard to do with inflation as it is, because actually costs typically are going up. And so another approach which churches sometimes use is the incremental increase, where they take last year's budgets and essentially add 3% or 5% to that. But for some churches, they get much more in the detail and they carefully adjust each of their budget lines. For other churches, they sort of they do this by taking last year's actuals and maybe building from those in terms of how they're going to set budgets for the new financial year. Other churches still, they take an approach of splitting their expenditure into kind of fixed costs where they can't really do very much about it, things like heating and lighting maybe, to your non-fixed costs where actually they can flex those budgets, and they sort of put their budget together based on the fixed costs, and then they look at the rest of the money they sort of feel like they have to play with. Many churches do build from a previous year's budget. There's a small number of churches out there that start building each budget each year from scratch. And that's obviously much more time consuming, but it does allow you to kind of reevaluate and make sure that you're building your budget around the right things. And then in terms of how to create a budget, I think there's often a couple of kind of key approaches. One is to build budgets upwards from budget holder requests, where essentially budget holders put in what they would like to spend, and a budget's somehow put together. And that's quite a difficult thing, because then often the amount that budget holders are requesting isn't doable within kind of what the church feel like is reasonable. Or the other way of doing it is that budget holders are decided at a senior level without much budget holder involvement, and then essentially budget holders get to outwork the amount that they've been allocated. And obviously there's somewhere in the middle. I think a key question for the team or the person putting together your church budget, and which you may want to consider, is what are some of the benefits and drawbacks to the approaches that you're using to put together your budget, and whether any improvements you might want to consider for kind of when you come to do budgeting next.
Really interesting, really interesting. I think many people have probably could identify with the budget that was created but ended up not being used, and the best laid plans of mice and ministers, so I think we can all recognise that, and so I think we're all wanting to know, and maybe ministers have heard of different approaches, and maybe maybe they more lend towards the top down or the bottom up approach, or I've also heard of sort of percentage based budgeting as well. But I think many people are saying, Sam, give us the answer. What's the answer? What's the right way to do it?
I mean, it's a great question, Chris, and you're going to be unsurprised and probably a little bit relieved to know there isn't one right option. So you don't need to go and rewrite your budget for your church. I'm sure what you've done is good. And actually, one of the things of budgeting is looking year on year to see how you can improve what you've done. It's a sort of an ongoing process rather than being a place that you land. And so I think that's a good thing to have in mind as you come to do budgeting. I mean, some of the approaches we've talked about are quicker, some are slower, some are more simple, some are more complex, some are proactive, whereas some are reactive. And each of the different kind of approaches that we've just kind of mentioned have their advantages and their disadvantages. I mean, for me personally, when if I was creating a budget, I think that there are a few kind of things that I would focus on. I would consider last year's actuals, as in the actual kind of income and expenditure, as a source of information to when creating the next year's budget, not necessarily to build it based on that or to kind of copy that across, but actually to have that as part of the kind of discussion, I think is really important. I think secondly is considering known price increases. If you create a budget without considering that, then you're probably creating a budget to fail. And so where you do know about price increases, I think the first thing that you should look to do is find alternative suppliers, like look at alternatives, and don't just accept the kind of price increases that suppliers will tend to push your way. But where you can't do that, where it's not possible to kind of renegotiate a contract or get a better price, then to build those into your budget, I think makes sense rather than budgeting kind of without doing that. I'd also say that a budget is a budgeting moment is a chance to consider what you're going to stop doing as well as what you're going to start doing. So churches often get really excited. It's the budgeting time. We can kind of do some blue sky thinking. We can do some praying. We can pop all that into a spreadsheet, and that's great. And that should be part of the process. But the other part of the process should be actually considering, okay, what might we stop doing as well as what might we start? And I think it's really important to get budget holders' ideas and input. because I think that's really key in terms of getting their buy-in and helping churches kind of with achieving kind of their vision and their mission in the way that they're kind of spending money. So if I had 3 top tips, I would say firstly, review your current expenditure and make sure it aligns with your vision. Aligning your budget with your vision will enable you to maximize the impact of the financial resources that kind of God has blessed you with to use as a church, and it will put you in a better position for achieving your vision and goals. I think just copying last year's budget or adding some percentage increases, obviously that is a very typical way churches will budget, and that's obviously very simple, and it means the next year's budget is probably going to be fairly realistic, but that assumes that what you did last year was good. And if it wasn't, and it wasn't necessarily helping you best achieve your vision and goals, then you're kind of just carrying that forward. So I think this question about asking how your current expenditure and how your current budget aligns with your vision is a really important one. For me, the questions to ask are how are each of the different areas of the budget or each of the different ministry areas helping to achieve the church's overall vision and goals? And also asking the question, do we have sufficient income to do everything we're trying to do, and to be realistic about that? I think that it's worth thinking about which areas need to increase and which areas need to decrease to reflect your priorities as a church. And I also think that as well as just budgeting, there's also the question of asking whether there's more effective ways to achieve the kind of vision and goals. Just throwing money at a particular budget area isn't necessarily going to help you necessarily achieve your vision and goals. And then essentially to use these questions to adjust your budget accordingly. So top tip number 1 would be just checking how your current expenditure aligns with your vision. Top tip number 2 would be being realistic. So creating a budget that adds up is often the kind of like the thing that churches are aiming at. They want the income, the expenditure to match. But if it's not realistic budget, then arguably there's not much point to doing that. And so when you're budgeting, one thing to consider is your current financial position when starting your budgeted discussions, because that will really affect how you put together a budget. Do you have lots of reserves, in which case actually the budgeting process might look quite different to if you're running quite a tight level of reserves for your church. So I think that that's also an important factor. And I think it's also worth remembering that budgeting is about prioritizing. Like having limited resources is actually encourages you to use those resources effectively. And so as you come to budgeting, you might be thinking, oh, I really hate this point in the year because we've always got more to do than, we have money for. But actually, why not look at this as actually a chance for you to spend money well? If you had loads of resources, sure, you could probably do some more things, but you wouldn't necessarily be forced to make some of those hard choices. And so to use the budgeting process to help you prioritize. It's also worth mentioning that there's always going to be unexpected costs and things that come up during the year. And so to counter this, when you're creating a budget, for you to include contingency either within each kind of budget area or as a kind of bulk item as part of your budget, and just be really careful when decreasing budget lines. Just know how specifically you're going to achieve that, otherwise you might be planning to fail. So you might want your energy costs to be 50% lower. Just putting it in the budget without a plan to achieve that is not actually going to help you. And then also just to be aware what type of budget you're putting together, because there are different types of budget. We might be part of the same church, and you might create a budget which is quite a prudent budget. I might create one that's quite aspirational, or maybe we might meet in the middle and create a kind of one that's more realistic. And so just understanding what type of budget you're creating, I think, is all important under this heading of being realistic. And then the third key tip I would say is using the budgeting process to empower your team. So you need to engage with your team. You need them to engage with your budget that you create. Otherwise, there's not going to be very much benefit of having a budget. It's just going to be a document that you feel happy about creating, but no one actually uses. And it's not going to influence the kind of decisions that are made. So helping your team understand how your budget fits into your bigger picture and how it's going to help you achieve your church's vision and goals is really important. And therefore, I would say involving key leaders and budget holders in the process is a really good idea and often a great way to get their buy-in. You might also want to consider who in your church has the skills and experience that you need in terms of the budgeting process and how many people you want involved. Too many people can make the process quite clunky. Too few people, actually, you're not maybe getting all the different kind of perspective and wisdom that you need in that room. So depending on your context, I typically recommend maybe 5 or 6 kind of people in that kind of core kind of budgeting group could be a good idea. And yeah, as well as asking budget holders for their ideas and suggestions, questions and to submit proposals, it's probably worth you just being clear with them what you're asking. Because if you know that a particular ministry area you're going to need to save 20 or 30% in the next financial year, going and asking that budget holder to kind of come to you with loads of ideas, that's not going to be very honoring for them, and that's not going to help them buy into the process. Equally, if you know that you're wanting to invest more in, say, your youth work ministry, then yes, do speak to the budget holder and ask them to come up with ideas that are in line with your vision and goals so that they can think about how they might use those resources well. So, yep, three key top tips. Hopefully that's helpful. They're just some of the things that I think need to be thought about when budgeting.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. I think we'd all love to save 50% on the energy bill, and the Lord willing, we will. But at the moment, it's not the case. But it does lead on to think about, how we budget, and actually, it makes me think about not the energy prices, but this topic does make me think of the kind of the spiritual principles of this, because I think of the words of Jesus where he says that where your treasure is, there your heart is also, and so there is a spiritual principle about where you place your money, where you assign those pounds and where they're going is actually an indication of your heart, and therefore an indication of the church's mission and the church's vision as well. So talk to me about some of those spiritual principles. What are some of the ones that we need to have a think about?
I think it's a good question, and we're not trying to create a budget. We're not a business. We're not trying to just be really analytical about creating a budget, although those skills are obviously important. There is definitely a spiritual kind of dimension, spiritual principles that we want to be thinking about. There's lots of different ones I could cover. I'm just going to pull out three for us today. The first of which is recognizing God's ownership. So recognizing that all money and all possessions are gifts from God, and that we're merely stewards of kind of those resources that he's given us. And I think recognizing this and kind of reflecting on this reflecting on this principle helps us reframe the kind of budgeting discussion. In Psalm 24, verse 1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." And I think this is really important as we come to budgeting, to just reframe the discussion around recognizing that all of the resources that we're trying to steward well are God's. And so I think that's really important. The second thing that I think we need to consider is a kind of really seeking God's guidance through prayer and inviting God in to to our financial kind of planning process, asking him for wisdom in the kind of budgeting decisions that we make, not just cracking on analytically, but also asking God, what are you saying here? What are you kind of calling us as a church to do? And also maybe looking at what he is actually already doing. Maybe there's a particular ministry in your church that he just seems to be blessing, or calling a group of people around. And so actually you might want to consider that as well. What is God actually saying to you as you pray, but also what is he showing you is he's doing inside your church as well. And I think that's really important. Proverbs 3 verse 5 to 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways submit to him and he will make your path straight." And I think this is really exciting. We're not just creating a budget, but actually we're creating a budget prayerfully and actually wanting God to lead us as we do that. And then the third principle I'm going to bring out is wise stewardship through planning. So a budget is, at the end of the day, a practical tool that helps us steward and manage the resources that we have with care and intention. The process of creating a budget helps ensure that we use money well and that we're purposeful and wise about doing so. But it's also worth mentioning that a budget doesn't prevent us from being spirit-led. In fact, you might want to consider, as you create your budget, setting aside money in your budget so that you're able to respond to where the Spirit's leading you during the year. It's quite hard up front to kind of figure out maybe what it's going to look like in the next sort of 12 or 15 months. And so why not set aside money in your budget to be led by the Spirit that you can use for kind of God's plans for your church as the year progresses?
Yeah, really, really good principles there. And actually, that final one makes me think of. I remember reading about Chris Hodges in the United States. He's runs Church of the Highlands, I think, and he talks about how their church actually budgets in margin in there, and I think it's a certain percentage, about 10%, and so they can then respond to needs as they arise, and they can be very flexible, and they're not over budgeted in that sense. Talk to me a little bit about that. What were your thoughts on sort of creating that sense of margin? Is that even possible to do that in the UK, to have margin in your budget where it's not necessarily assigned? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, It's obviously comes down to priorities, and I would suggest it's a really, really good principle to do because you won't necessarily know up front kind of what it is what it is going to happen during the year, and you want to be in a position to respond. And so one of the I would say kind of being a kind of a good steward of money is to kind of make sure that you have set aside that money to kind of do those things that God might be calling you to do. I think also it's really helpful in terms of kind of allowing some flexibility within your budget. Remember, a budget is just a tool. It's not ultimately, like ultimately you don't need to kind of say, well, we're not actually buying coffee this Sunday because our budget says no. Actually, it's a tool that you can use. And so actually I think it's really a really great idea to look to build in margin in your budget. And I think there's different ways you can do that. You can build it obviously into the different budget lines, or maybe you actually just have a budget line called margin where you then just get to kind of prayerfully consider during the year how you can best spend that money. It also allows a bit of flexibility as well, so you can set aside money for margin essentially, and if more comes in than you're anticipating, that might give you some more money to use for those things that kind of God's calling you to do during your financial year as well.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Well, of course, that it makes me think about this tension that exists, and I'd love for you to speak to this, especially when we think about budgeting. The words faith and budgeting with faith, and but also stewardship comes up, and we they almost seem like they're kind of two tribes going to war a little bit. That we've got some people that say no, we've got to go by faith on this, and some people are saying no, we've got to be good stewards on this. How can we balance faith and stewardship in budgeting?
A really good question. And on the face of it, it does, like you say, seem like it's kind of a left and a right, two opposite things that are having to be worked out together. And I think probably just reflecting on those two angles is really important. So wise financial stewardship means managing money responsibly, setting a realistic budget, ensuring that your church meets its current obligations, paying staff, making sure you pay rent, all of those things that you should be doing as kind of using kind of God's money wisely and wisely stewarding that. But then the faith angle to it also means ensuring that your spending is aligned with the church's mission and vision and kind of goals that kind of you feel like God has kind of given you to work towards. And also it means making plans and decisions in a really kind of prayerful way, wanting God to kind of lead you in that and trusting in God's provision. So I think it's clearly a tough one, and it's clearly a both and rather than one or the other. And so it is a hard one. There's a tension there. I mean, I would suggest one of the things that you can do is make sure that you have the right people in the room, and having people to pray for those people making the decisions as they make them, I think is a really, really important thing, because then actually trying to decide a budget on your own I would suggest is quite hard. But actually, as a group, you can use the gifts that God's kind of given those people in your church to be able to help to kind of lean on him and create a really great budget for your church. I would also suggest that one of the advantages of doing this is it means that it sort of avoids one person sort of just feeling like God might be saying something and kind of and so therefore the budget's planned based on that. Actually, I would suggest that if God wants to lead your church in a kind of faith step, and then he's likely to kind of speak that out to more than just one person. And I would suggest that others in that room, if you do have 5 or 6 people, would either get a sense of the same thing, or maybe just be filled with faith for kind of what you're feeling God calling your church to do. So I think it is both, and I think that having the right people in the room, having people that are kind of really wise and have the right gifts needed, and a really kind of prayerful approach, means that you can get that balance between kind of stewardship and faith. You can get that working well.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly think that having wise people in the room there's no substitute for it, because wise people, if they have godly wisdom, there's a sense of faith about them, but there's also a sense of being a good steward. They're going to make sure that balance is just right. So then nothing beats having really good wise people in the room. Okay, brilliant. Well, let's move on a little bit from the kind of more spiritual principles. I'd love to dive in. Maybe we can make this a sort of a quick question. But we've already talked about maybe some ways of budgeting, but I'd love to sort of find some of the maybe common pitfalls that we find when it comes to creating a budget. What are some of those things that you've seen, and maybe some of those things that we can avoid when creating a budget?
Yes, and so we have covered a number of these already, and we'll cover a few more, I think, in some of the other questions that we'll move on to. I just want to pull out a few really. One is not having a budget. I think that is definitely a pitfall, which some churches fall into. But a more common one that I see is this idea of spending lots of time creating a budget and seeing churches, putting quite a number of hours and quite a lot of effort in creating a budget, and then essentially for multiple different reasons, which we'll cover in a second, don't then actually go on to use it. And I think that is a problem. I think a third thing would be creating a budget and then just sticking really rigidly to it and forgetting that budget is a tool to enable you to manage your finances well, rather than a bit of paper that you have to kind of, rigidly stick to. Obviously, there's a balance to be had, but I think that can be kind of another pitfall of kind of like getting the wrong kind of relationship with your budget, where you're kind of like, you're making all financial decisions based on that, rather than kind of maybe having some flexibility and just kind of a bit of flexibility within that. I think involving your team in the budgeting process, I guess, would be another pitfall that I see. So not getting people buying into the budget that's being created, and therefore not having the impact that you hoped it would. The budget is typically outworked by the different budget holders in your church, and so if they're not bought in, if they haven't kind of been communicated to about your budget, it's great that you had 5 or 6 brilliant people coming up with your budget, but actually it's not going to have the impact. Then finally, probably just getting this balance right between stewardship and faith, I think is really important. And I think we're saying the mitigation, or the kind of like the way that can be done well, is by having 5 or 6 wise people in those discussions as you come to considering budgets for future financial years.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it probably leads us on to think about, well, we've looked at creating a budget, but of course we've got to manage that budget as well. So I'd love to get your top tips on how we can best manage the budget.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And for me, this is like the business end, like as in you've got to do this well. Otherwise, what you've kind of the time and effort you've put into preparing a budget is likely to not have the returns that you're hoping for. So yeah, I've got 4 top tips, maybe 5. We'll see where this goes. And so my first top tip is to provide decision makers with easy access to accurate, up-to-date financial reports, so they can engage with church finances, manage expenditure, and make informed decisions. And so this, I think, is a really important part of managing a budget. And if your church currently doesn't have a finance software package that helps you do this, then either check out ExpensePlus, check out other options out there. But for me, this is a bit of a fundamental. If you want people to engage with your church finances, if you want them to actually be able to use your budget, they've got to be able to see real-time data. They've got to be able to access it at a click of a button. It's no good that they have to ask your bookkeeper for a report next Tuesday when they happen to be working. Like they've got to be able to access information in a real-time kind of way. Top tip number 2 would be to provide decision makers and budget holders with training, not just for how to manage a budget, but also training for how to understand financial reports. And I think that this is where lots and lots of churches go wrong, because the person creating the budget may well have gifts in understanding finances. They may well, do that as part of their day job if they maybe work in a business, or maybe they just are wired that way, or they have skills and gifting, and that's brilliant. You want people that are creating a budget that have that, but you need to recognize that most budget holders, the people out working the budget, probably don't have those skills, and are probably in reality not going to ask. They're probably going to be afraid of asking. They may not actually feel that confident with maths to begin with, let alone budgets and spreadsheets and reports. And so this is really, really important, because if you don't actually train your budget holders to say, look, this is what your budget looks like, this is how we want you to use your money, this, when we send this financial report, it means this, and if this happens, can you look at this? If you don't train your team to do that, then you're probably going to have limited impact of having created a budget and communicated finances. I think it's also really important as part of this to communicate expectations around kind of how the church's money should be spent, because none of us come to this with kind of neutrally. Like, we all have our own baggage. Like, how you choose to spend money, Chris, might be a really kind of prudent approach, where you look to save money and to kind of like always make sure you have money set aside. I might be more of a kind of spender. Hey, I've just seen this thing today, I want to buy it because it's brilliant and it will save me loads of time, and I bought it already, and it's arrived next week. Like, as in, like, that might be my approach. And so we want to be careful that we don't bring a kind of our own kind of like view and approach to spending money when it into the kind of conversation. Otherwise, what you're likely to end up with is budget holders, maybe like yourself, that kind of, they get £1,000 budget and they only ever spend about £50, which you don't want. That's equally just as bad as kind of overspending. And then you end up with maybe budget holders like me that spend way more than their budget just because that's what they would do with their own kind of personal finances. So I think it's really important to communicate around kind of expectations with spending money. And again, this comes under the kind of banner of training. And so, yeah, just to summarize, without providing budget holders and those making decisions with training, you're unlikely to get the impact that you're wanting from creating a super duper budget. Tip number 3 then would be to keep it simple. And I think this is, again, a pitfall that I see so many churches fall into. Maybe they, at some point last year, someone asked them for this bit of information, so they added it to their financial report. And then someone else asked for another bit of information a few months later, which also got added to the report. And before long, you end up with financial reports that are super long and super complicated. You also end up with kind of summaries that are really difficult to understand. There are several page email that then just gets filed. And so for me, I would always encourage churches to keep it simple. If you're wanting non-financial people to engage with finances, then don't send them long, complicated emails. And so I would just encourage churches that are watching this to think, look, is your summary email, is it 4 or 5 really easy to understand bullet points? And attached to that, or a link to that, is there a report that maybe a couple of reports that are just 2 or 3 pages long, where people can kind of find key information they need? Maybe you need to include links to find further information. That's great, because then people that want to go deeper can do that. But actually, kind of the financial information you're communicating needs to be simple. Otherwise, you'll find that only yourself and maybe one other person will ever look at it. And actually, again, your budget holders and those kind of involved in finances at your church won't actually be kind of engaging in the way that you want. So yeah, that'll be my top tip number 3. Top tip number 4 would be to implement an effective process for reviewing finances, because spotting problems early and making changes will put you in a far better position to forward plan and to resolve issues. And so my question would be, does your church have a monthly review? Who's involved in this? Does it help you to spot issues and to make changes? And then if you're using a accounting package like ExpensePlus, you'll be able to compare kind of not just see your income and expenditure to date, you'll also be able to compare this to your budget to date and see your variance to date. So you'll be able to track how you're doing versus where you thought you were. And you'll also be able to forward project and see where things are likely to land if things continue. And so, yeah, again, just ensuring that you have a good and effective process for reviewing finances, that they aren't just reports that are sent out retrospectively. They're actually kind of reports that people engage with, and you use the kind of information you're seeing to help shape and form where you go with your church finances.
That's great. I mean, all of this reminds me of there's a very famous episode of the US Office where they realize they have a bit of surplus in their budget, and if they don't spend it that day, then they will lose the budget. And so they're sort of debating whether they spend it on chairs or they spend it on a new copy machine. And it made me think actually of sort of church finances. And it'd be great to get your thoughts on this kind of, what are your thoughts on the kind of use it or lose it approach, especially when you're looking at reviewing and things like that? I think many people are worried that, oh, hang on a minute, if I haven't spent it, it's going to be taken away and things like that. What are your thoughts on that side of reviewing the budgets and things like that as you go through the year?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough one. And I think it comes probably related and comes back to the conversation of we all have different approaches to budgeting to begin with. And so I think that's worth acknowledging. I mean, in terms of income and expenditure, naturally, it doesn't carry between financial years. That's not a thing. So fund balances, they carry between financial years. So if your food bank fund has 10 grand in it at the end of last year, that will carry through to next year. But budget lines themselves don't. So if you did want to carry money through, that would be having to essentially decrease a budget in one year and maybe making a surplus, and then the next year increasing the budget, which would make a loss. And obviously those two will balance out. It is possible to do that. I mean, I would go back to helping your budget holders to get the bigger vision as to how what they're spending fits into the context of what needs to be spent. So yeah, I'd probably draw back on that. I probably would say that, yeah, you need to be flexible. So if the reason that a budget is going to be lower one year and higher next year is simply to do with the point something's purchased, and you create accounts on a cash basis rather than an accruals basis, then yeah, probably you might want to make those adjustments. Otherwise, yeah, I wouldn't be encouraging your teams to spend money to use their expenditure up, which is what you see businesses do quite often, because it's use it or lose it. And worse, you not only lose it, you get a lower budget next year. I wouldn't probably be setting out to budget on necessarily purely based on what a particular ministry area spent in the prior year, partly because it probably then encourages this gaming of, actually, if I go £200 over budget, I'll actually get a bigger budget next year. So yeah, I think probably you can counter that by just the way that you start the budgeting process. But for me, reviewing it as you go is really, really important, because then you can actually make changes. And maybe it is that your church does need to save expenditure, and actually the fact that your kids ministry is underspent is actually a really helpful thing to fit with that bigger thing of what you're trying to do. So again, this comes down to communication with your budget holders, where you at, and not just taking a budget rigidly, but actually being prepared to adjust based on whether your income is higher or lower during the financial year, and asking your budget holders to kind of support you with doing that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Fantastic. Well, that is absolutely brilliant gold advice, really, on setting budgets. So it leaves me with only one final question. I'm very excited about this. Sam, what is your favourite dessert?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me this question, having just finished watching Gavin Smith on your podcast recently from the church office. And so, Gavin, if you're watching then and you're enjoying your creme brulee, then I'm going to go for something slightly different. I'm going to go for a fruit crumble with custard, because I just think this is a great autumn dessert. The nights are drawing in, it's getting colder. I just think you can't beat a fruit crumble with custard. And it's got fruit in it, right? So it's got to be healthy.
Well, I mean, absolutely, sure. I'm on board with this. Of course, it is. I mean, obviously, a great choice there. But it does beg the question: which fruit are you going for in your crumble? Because I think that's going to be very important. So, for example, I was at a restaurant this weekend with my wife, and my wife, she ordered a peach crumble, which I've never had before, and I tried a little bit of it, and it was pretty good actually, and not too bad. So what fruit are you going for in your crumble?
Maybe I'll change my mind based on the peach crumble being good. I would probably go for my wife's apple and blackberry crumble. I think that is a classic crumble. Otherwise, if you push me to come up with something else, maybe a rhubarb crumble. Quite like rhubarb crumbles as well.
Yes.
So something like that. Any fruit really, although maybe not any fruit. I think some fruit doesn't work in crumbles so well.
Yes, well, rhubarb crumble does remind me of my dad's garden, which he would bring all sorts of different fruits in for a crumble. If it was a good week, it was rhubarb crumble. If it was a bad week, it was gooseberry crumble. And gooseberries do not make a good crumble. I'm just going to say that, Dad, if you're watching or listening to this, which you're probably not, which is great, it's a terrible crumble. Don't have gooseberry crumble. But I think apple and blackberry is a really, really solid choice. Rhubarb is also a very, very solid choice. So both excellent choices. And you say custard as well. So would you have that with, so some people swear by custard with cream or custard with ice cream or just custard alone. So are you having the custard with something else?
I mean, now you've offered it, it'd be rude not to. So I'm going to go for Alpro custard, because I have dairy-free custard, which actually Alpro is pretty good. I'd go for maybe some Swedish glacé ice cream if I'm going to add a bit of ice cream to it. So yeah, I think adding something to a crumble is perfect. But I would have to say, if the crumble's hot, whatever you add to it has got to be cold. For me, it's got to be cold. Adding hot custard to hot crumble, it doesn't work for me. I know it works for lots of people. So yeah, I'd go for cold custard, or better still, cold custard and ice cream.
Well, this is a turn up for the books. So I think you're the first person that's ever suggested cold custard. So that is the cat is amongst the pigeons, I think it's probably worth saying, or amongst the crumble maybe. Well, do you know what? A great choice. I'm not sure I can go with you with the cold custard, but I'm with you with the crumble. I'm with you with hot custard, and actually Swedish glacé. Excellent choice, actually, is a dairy-free ice cream. It is very good. So yes, excellent. Well, very, very good. Fruit crumble, good choice there. Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciated it. And I think ministers watching this, listening to this, it's so important that as we grow as ministers, growing in the area of budgeting and finance is just so important. So thank you for taking the time today. Really, really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of That CPD Show. For more episodes, why not subscribe and give us a review? It really helps us out. See you next time.